Have you ever been in a situation where someone you least expected came to your rescue? Imagine being in a luxury store, surrounded by wealth and opulence, only to witness a humbling turn of events. This is exactly what happened when Lee Min-ho's driver found himself in an uncomfortable situation at an upscale shopping destination. It all began when the driver, a man who had always been discreet and humble, found himself waiting outside a high-end boutique. As he patiently waited for his boss, Lee Min-ho, to finish his shopping, he had no idea that this day would turn into something much more than a simple errand. The store was filled with extravagant shoppers, the kind who would normally look down on someone like him, someone who worked behind the scenes, blending into the background. He was used to this kind of treatment, but today, something was different. The driver stood in the corner of the store, his presence barely acknowledged by the high-profile shoppers who walked past him, their eyes locked on the latest fashion trends. He had been in this situation many times before, but this time, something strange began to happen. One of the store employees, perhaps feeling a sense of superiority, walked up to him with an air of arrogance. "Excuse me, sir," she said with a sharp tone, "but this area is for customers only. You cannot stand here." It was clear she hadn't recognized who he was, nor did she seem to care. The driver, used to being invisible in the high society he served, felt a sting of humiliation. But before he could respond, the door opened, and in walked Lee Min-ho. Now, you might be wondering, what would Lee Min-ho do in a situation like this? Would he ignore it, or would he stand up for his driver, the man who had faithfully served him for so long? As the door swung open, Lee Min-ho entered the boutique, his presence immediately noticeable. His tall, charismatic figure caught the attention of everyone in the store, and for a moment, it seemed as if the world had paused. The shoppers turned their heads, their eyes now focused on the famous actor. But Lee Min-ho wasn't here for the luxury items or the extravagant prices. He wasn't here to flaunt his wealth or status. Instead, his gaze immediately landed on his driver, still standing in the corner, looking visibly uncomfortable. The store employee, unaware of the identity of the man she had just humiliated, didn't recognize the connection. But Lee Min-ho did. He walked over to his driver with a calm, composed demeanor, and stood beside him. The room fell silent. The tension was thick as everyone watched the interaction between the two men. Without a word, Lee Min-ho turned to the employee, who still hadn't realized who she had just insulted. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Lee Min-ho said, his voice firm but not angry. "This man is not just my driver. He's been with me for years, and I trust him completely. And you should know that no one deserves to be treated with disrespect, no matter who they are or how they are dressed." The employee, her face turning pale, quickly realized her mistake. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and she stammered, trying to apologize. But Lee Min-ho wasn't interested in her apology. He wasn't concerned with the fact that the employee had acted out of turn. What mattered to him was standing up for the people who had been loyal to him for years, the people who helped him behind the scenes but never sought the spotlight. He looked back at his driver, offering him a reassuring smile. "You've done nothing wrong. Don't let anyone make you feel less than what you are," Lee Min-ho said, his words carrying a weight of genuine kindness and respect. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to his driver, who was now beaming with pride. The other shoppers, who had been watching in silence, seemed to absorb the moment. They were witnessing something extraordinary, an act of kindness and humility from someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Lee Min-ho's reputation as an actor had always been stellar, but this moment proved that his character was even greater. The store employee, now visibly flustered, apologized profusely. Lee Min-ho simply nodded, not dwelling on the incident any longer. "Let's go, my friend," he said to his driver, as the two walked toward the exit, leaving behind the whispers and surprised faces of the other shoppers. But as they left the store, a question lingered in the air: what did this incident say about Lee Min-ho as a person? And what can we learn from his reaction? As Lee Min-ho and his driver exited the luxury store, the atmosphere outside felt different. The air was still and crisp, a stark contrast to the tension that had lingered inside. The two men walked in silence for a moment, but there was a noticeable shift in the energy around them. It wasn't just the cool breeze that made the air feel more refreshing, it was the weight of the moment, the power of standing up for someone when it mattered most. For Lee Min-ho, this wasn't about defending his driver to impress others. This was simply a matter of respect, dignity, and treating people with kindness regardless of their position in society. "Thank you," his driver finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but filled with genuine gratitude. He had never expected such an act of loyalty from his employer. The man who had worked for Lee Min-ho for years had always seen him as more than just a famous actor. He saw him as a good person, someone who treated people right. But today, Lee Min-ho had shown him that his belief in him was well placed. Lee Min-ho gave a warm, understanding smile. "It's nothing. You've been there for me through thick and thin. The least I can do is show some appreciation." His words were simple but meaningful. In that moment, the actor wasn't a star, he was just a man doing the right thing for the person who had been a constant in his life. But as they walked toward the car, a thought crossed Lee Min-ho's mind. The incident wasn't just a random act of disrespect, it was a reflection of something deeper. In the world of luxury, fame, and opulence, how often did people forget the value of basic respect for others? How often did people fail to see the humanity in those who worked tirelessly behind the scenes? It was a problem that went beyond this particular moment. "Do you think this happens often?" Lee Min-ho asked, his voice thoughtful. "People being treated unfairly just because of their status or the way they look?" His driver hesitated for a moment before answering. "It happens more than people realize. Most of the time, it's subtle, just a look, a comment, or an assumption. But it still stings, you know?" Lee Min-ho nodded. He understood. He had seen this kind of behavior in his own life, even though he lived in a world where appearances often mattered more than anything else. He had witnessed the way people were treated based on their clothing, their job, or their social status. It was a harsh reality, one that didn't sit well with him. As they reached the car, the driver opened the door for Lee Min-ho, but the actor paused for a moment, turning to face him. "You know, this could be a reminder for both of us. It's easy to get caught up in the world of fame, wealth, and luxury. But at the end of the day, it's the way we treat others that matters the most." His driver smiled, his heart feeling a little lighter. Lee Min-ho's words resonated with him deeply. It wasn't just about the act of standing up for him in the store, it was about the principles Lee Min-ho lived by, principles that made him not just a beloved actor but also someone worthy of admiration. As they drove off, the car was filled with a sense of calm, a peace that comes from knowing that respect, kindness, and humility are still alive in a world that often seems to prioritize the opposite. But even as they drove away from the luxury store, the question remained, what kind of world are we building, and how much does it matter to us to stand up for others, especially when it's not expected? In that moment, Lee Min-ho had shown the world that true character is not defined by the brand of clothes we wear or the car we drive, it's defined by how we treat others, regardless of their status or position in society. It's a lesson that transcends wealth, fame, and all the material things we accumulate over the years. As the driver and the actor drove off into the night, their bond had grown even stronger. And with it, a newfound sense of hope began to form in the minds of those who had witnessed the event. Perhaps, just maybe, a small act of kindness could start a ripple effect that would lead to a world where everyone, no matter who they were, was treated with the respect they deserved. The next few days after the incident at the luxury store seemed to carry a renewed energy for Lee Min-ho and his driver. It wasn't just the lingering satisfaction of doing the right thing that stayed with them, it was the conversations that followed, the ripple effect their actions had on others, and the way people started talking about respect and kindness in ways they hadn't before. Lee Min-ho's simple, yet profound reaction to the situation sparked a conversation that reverberated through social media and among those who admired him. News outlets, influencers, and fans alike began to pick up on the story. It wasn't the kind of headline that screamed drama or scandal, but rather a headline that carried an important message. Lee Min-ho stands up for his driver in a moment of humiliation at a luxury store, the articles read. Actor's reaction surprises onlookers, showing true character beyond fame. The story quickly gained traction because it was different from the usual sensational news that dominated the media. Instead of being about an outburst or a confrontation, it was about someone famous using their position to do good. To say the least, it left people with a lot to think about. Lee Min-ho had never been one to boast about his actions. He didn't want attention for simply doing what was right. But what struck him the most was the response from his fans. Many of them took to social media to share their thoughts on the incident, expressing admiration for Lee Min-ho's character. They were inspired by his act of kindness, and they began to use it as a reminder in their own lives to treat others with more respect and understanding. Kindness is powerful, one fan wrote on Instagram. We should all follow Lee Min-ho's example of standing up for what's right, regardless of who's watching. Another fan shared, "It's easy to forget that no one is above respect, but Lee Min-ho reminded us that it's not the fame or wealth that defines us, it's the way we treat people." It wasn't long before the incident became more than just a story about Lee Min-ho and his driver. It became a moment of reflection for many. The story spread, not just because of the famous actor's actions, but because it offered a much-needed reminder about the importance of humility, respect, and compassion in a world that often prioritizes superficial things. Back in the car, Lee Min-ho and his driver had a few more discussions about the impact of the moment. "You've seen the news, right?" his driver asked, a slight smile on his face. Lee Min-ho nodded, but he wasn't interested in the attention. He'd been in the spotlight for years, and though he knew it came with the territory, he didn't seek it out. He was used to seeing his name in the headlines, but the type of attention this time felt different. "It's nice, I suppose," Lee Min-ho said thoughtfully. "But it's not about the fame or the recognition. It's about how we choose to live our lives. If this story makes people think twice before judging someone based on their job or appearance, then I'm happy." His driver nodded, looking out the window. "It's funny, isn't it? How one small act can make people pause and reflect. I guess sometimes, we just need a reminder of what really matters." Lee Min-ho chuckled softly. "Exactly. It doesn't have to be grand gestures or huge acts of heroism. Just doing the right thing in the moment, standing up for someone who's been wronged, that's what counts." For Lee Min-ho, the incident wasn't about proving his worth. He didn't need to prove anything. But what mattered to him was that this small act had reminded people that no one was above anyone else. That even in a world of fame, fortune, and luxury, respect was a universal currency that everyone deserved. As the days went by, the incident seemed to have a life of its own. Lee Min-ho's reaction was shared far and wide, and it left a lasting impression on those who followed the story. It was a quiet, powerful reminder of what true character looks like. As the days passed, the impact of Lee Min-ho's actions continued to echo throughout the media. The ripple effect went beyond the fans and public figures who were applauding him, it began to affect the people who were part of his inner circle as well. Lee Min-ho's colleagues, friends, and even those who worked behind the scenes with him were inspired by his humility and integrity. One particular conversation stood out. During a casual dinner with a few close friends, Lee Min-ho was approached by his longtime manager, who had been quietly observing the conversations around him. "You know," his manager said, "people are really talking about the way you handled that situation. I've heard so many stories of people doing the same in their own lives, standing up for someone in small ways." Lee Min-ho smiled, not because of the praise, but because of the potential that had been unlocked by a single act of kindness. "It feels good to know that it's making a difference, but honestly, I didn't expect this kind of attention. I just did what felt right at the time." His manager laughed softly. "Sometimes, the smallest actions have the greatest impact. You've always been known for being grounded and humble, but now people are seeing it even more. It's not just about acting on screen, it's about how you live your life off screen too." Lee Min-ho nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the people who had supported him along the way. It's easy to forget the importance of empathy in this business. We can get caught up in our own bubbles, thinking that the world revolves around us. But the truth is, we're all human, and we all deserve to be treated with respect. As they continued to talk, Lee Min-ho couldn't help but reflect on the power of everyday interactions. It wasn't the glamorous photo ops or the red carpet moments that defined a person's true character, it was the way they treated others when the cameras weren't around. And in that quiet moment in the luxury store, Lee Min-ho had chosen to act from a place of kindness, and that was what truly made a difference. Over the next few weeks, more stories emerged from fans who had been inspired by Lee Min-ho's actions. Some shared experiences of standing up for co-workers who had been unfairly treated, while others talked about small acts of kindness they had extended to strangers in need. There was a common theme that ran through all these stories: the idea that empathy and kindness were powerful forces that had the potential to create positive change, one person at a time. The media coverage began to shift focus as well. Instead of solely focusing on Lee Min-ho's status as a star, the narrative expanded to include the broader message of respect and humanity. Journalists praised him not just for his career but for the integrity and decency he exhibited in his personal life. It was a reminder that, regardless of fame or wealth, being a good person was the greatest achievement of all. One evening, as Lee Min-ho sat in his quiet home, scrolling through the countless messages he had received, he found a particular comment that stood out. It was from a fan who shared a touching story. "I've always been shy and withdrawn," the fan wrote. "I often feel invisible at work, and there's this one colleague who never fails to belittle me. But after hearing about your story, I decided to stand up for myself today. I told him how I felt, and for the first time, I didn't feel small. I owe that to you. Thank you for showing me what it means to be confident in my own worth." Lee Min-ho paused for a moment, deeply moved by the message. It reminded him that his actions had not just affected the people who were physically present at the store but had also touched those who were silently observing, those who had felt isolated or overlooked in their own lives. For Lee Min-ho, this story wasn't about being a hero, it was about showing others that it was possible to make a difference, even in the smallest of moments. The ripple effect of kindness was far-reaching, and he realized that the story had taken on a life of its own. People were taking the lessons he had unwittingly taught them and applying them in their own lives, finding strength in their own voices, and standing up for themselves and others. The impact of that one moment in the store had transcended the confines of that space. It had become a movement, one that reminded people of the power of kindness, respect, and the simple act of standing up for what was right. Lee Min-ho's story had turned into something much bigger than a celebrity moment. It had become a call to action for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly, anyone who had felt unseen or unimportant. And, in the end, it wasn't about the fame or the luxury store, it was about creating a world where empathy and humanity could thrive. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of the story continued to resonate with Lee Min-ho. He had become a symbol, not of fame or fortune, but of genuine humanity and integrity. What started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into a movement that encouraged people to think critically about how they treated others. The world seemed to be slowly waking up to the idea that kindness and respect weren't just reserved for the privileged few but were universal values that everyone could embrace. For Lee Min-ho, this experience had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't about the public recognition or the flattering headlines. It was about realizing that the simplest actions could create the most profound impact. He'd always known that he had the ability to influence people through his work, but now, he understood that the most significant influence he could have came from how he lived his life off-screen, how he treated people when no one was watching. The incident in the store had opened his eyes to the power of empathy. It had reminded him of the importance of staying grounded, no matter how high he climbed in his career. He had learned that the true measure of a person's worth wasn't in their accomplishments but in their ability to make others feel seen, valued, and respected. As Lee Min-ho drove home one evening, his thoughts turned to his driver, the man who had unknowingly become part of this larger narrative. The two had talked about the incident many times since, each conversation reinforcing the bond between them. The driver, who had always been a quiet and humble man, had expressed his gratitude repeatedly, but Lee Min-ho had always reassured him that it was the least he could do. "You know," the driver said one day as they were talking about the ongoing buzz around the incident, "I never thought something like this would happen. I've worked for many celebrities, but I've never seen anyone stand up for me like that." Lee Min-ho smiled, not out of pride, but out of a deep sense of fulfillment. "It wasn't just about standing up for you," he explained. "It was about standing up for what's right. I'm just glad it made a difference." The driver paused, reflecting on Lee Min-ho's words. "You know, I've been thinking about it a lot. Maybe it's time to start standing up for others too. Not just for me, but for anyone who's treated unfairly. I've learned a lot from you." Lee Min-ho nodded, genuinely moved. "That's all anyone can ask for. We may not always be able to change the world, but we can make small changes in the lives of the people around us. And if everyone did that, maybe the world would be a better place. As the days continued to pass, Lee Min-ho noticed a subtle shift in the way people interacted with him. It wasn't just admiration for his fame, it was respect for the way he conducted himself. He felt a deeper connection with his fans, his friends, and even strangers. People were no longer just interested in his latest film or his career, they were interested in the person he was, the values he stood for, and the example he set. One day, as Lee Min-ho was walking through the streets of Seoul, he was stopped by a young fan, a teenage girl who had a shy look in her eyes. "Excuse me, Mr. Lee Min-ho," she said hesitantly. "I just wanted to thank you. After hearing about what happened at the store, I felt inspired to stand up for my best friend. She's been bullied at school, and I've always been too afraid to speak up. But after hearing your story, I found the courage to say something." Lee Min-ho smiled warmly, touched by her words. "I'm glad my story helped you find your voice," he said, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing. Keep standing up for your friends and yourself." As they parted ways, Lee Min-ho felt a profound sense of peace. It wasn't just the fans or the media attention that mattered to him, it was the realization that the world was beginning to change, even if only in small, subtle ways. His actions had inspired others to do the same. They weren't just standing up for themselves, they were standing up for others, breaking down the walls of judgment and prejudice that had long been ingrained in society. And as he walked away, he couldn't help but feel that perhaps, just perhaps, the world was slowly starting to understand what truly mattered. Kindness, respect, empathy, these were the things that would define the future. So, if you've made it this far, type respect in the comments. Let's all remember that true strength lies in how we treat those around us.